and because you are taking on more debt, you are not taxed on it, where you invest $100,000 in your business and the return is infinite. Now, if you're wondering, where would you find a property like this? Calgary is one place where you can. Windsor is another place if you want to stay in Ontario. We don't know how the exchange rates will play in 30 years from future. What if Indian currency has depreciated even further? The money will actually be worth less than what you invested. So the objective of every investor would be to reduce the interest rates on their debt and to increase their ROI on the investments. Then of course there's a risk of what if the market crashes, because real estate is not for the light-hearted. And the way I mitigate these two risks is that most wealthy people and millionaires invest in real estate. Why is that the case? We'll find out in today's video, so let's get started. So in today's presentation, we'll be talking about three things. We'll first understand what debt means and how the math work on it. Then we'll understand risk in association with debt. And finally, we'll be talking about investing in real estate and why. Super simple fact-based presentation filled with numbers. Now, you don't have to hit the like button and subscribe button right now, but if you like anything about this presentation by the end of it, do hit the subscribe button because it will help me reach more people like you. And if you have not subscribed to my free newsletter yet, I'll highly recommend that you do that because every Sunday, 8 a.m. EST, I come up with amazing tips that can help you grow into a 1% mindset and eventually make a ton of money. Coming back to the presentation, let's first understand the difference between compounding when it comes to debt and investing. Let me explain. Let's take two scenarios. The first one is that you take $100,000 loan and the second one is that you invest that $100,000. Let's say you take a loan at 8% per year for 30 years. That's the interest rate that you will get on a normal line of credits right now. But let's say that 8% interest stays for 30 years. And in scenario 2, you invest this $100,000 on a 4% interest for 30 years. So 8% loan, 4% interest on the investment that you're making. Your monthly payment on the loan will be $725 per month, and this you'll do for 30 years. So in all, your total repayment, including the initial $100,000, will be $261,000. It's crazy, right? You'll be paying over $150,000 of interest on this. But if you use the same $100,000 loan and invest that at even 4% interest rate for 30 years, same like-to-like comparison, one is loan, one is investing, but the interest rate is half that you get on the investing, you would end up with a lot more than what your total repayment is. Now, for a lot of you, this calculation is obvious, but for those who are wondering why this is happening is because if you take a $100,000 loan and you repay the loan, you actually calculate interest on the reduced amount. So let's say you have a $100,000 loan, you repay $10,000 as principal. So from next year, you'll only be charged interest on $90,000 and so on and so forth. Therefore, the reverse compounding is at play here. However, when you invest $100,000, your money grows by 10% and then it grows on top of that 10% and then it grows. It's a net positive compounding that's happening, whereas in debt, it's the reverse. And therefore, if I take a loan at 8% and invest that at 4% interest, I'll still end up making a profit. Now imagine if you are able to make more than 4% return, let's say a 6% return. The amount of money that you will have is about $574,000. It will be more than double the amount of repayment that you make on the 8% loan, and still the return is just 6%. If you take 8%, it will be over $1 million. If you take 10% return, it will be over $1.7 million. And that's the full power of compounding. That's the reason why a lot of wealthy people who know what they are doing in their business, or if they are real estate investors and they know how to multiply their money in real estate, they borrow money from the bank and then multiply that, because this math is coming into play. And because they are an expert in doing this, they can actually run this cycle unlimited number of times and they can literally print money. Of course, there's risk in doing this, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, the reason why a lot of people invest in real estate is because banks actually give a loan. So this $100,000 loan that you will get will be at a much lower interest rate. And let's say that interest rate is 5%. Your repayment will only be $192,000. And even if you earn 4% interest on this $100,000, you still stand to make over $100,000 in gains after repaying the loan. So the objective of every investor would be to reduce the interest rates on their debt and to increase their ROI on the investments. And that's how they'll make unlimited cash. Now, looking at this mathematics, it's absolutely a no-brainer to invest using debt. However, what we have not accounted for right now is risk. So let's talk about risk. So now let's understand risk, and what I've done is I've actually divided the risk based on the different asset classes. So as you go down from savings account all the way to business and real estate, the risk actually increases, and I'll talk about the risks that are involved there as well. But let's talk about the year-on-year returns. So let's say you are doing a savings account, you're just putting your money into a savings account, and that gives you a 2.5% return. Now, right now you're getting almost 4 to 4.5% return, in some cases, but on average, a good return on an account like EQ Bank or Tangerine would be about 2 to 2.5%. Let's take about 2.5% across 30 years, and that would 2x your money. So $100,000 will be worth $209,000. But if you adjust this number to inflation, which is 3% every single year, the average is about 2.5 to 3%. Let's take 3%. The money will actually be worth less than what you invested, which will be worth $86,000. Now, same way, if you invest in bonds and GIC, you will get, let's say, a 4% interest. Now, the interest rate that you're getting right now in Canada even is 5.5 to 6%, but I'm taking like a 30-year average. Let's say it's 4%, and your money will almost 3x, more than 3x, and inflation adjusted, it's still a 33% gain over 30 years. So not that impressive. Now, between investing in bonds and GIC and savings account, the risk is that in order to get a slightly better return, you are locking your money in most cases, and therefore there's a liquidity risk here. But you are getting a much bigger return, and instead of 2xing your money, you can 3x your money. Now let's move down the risk ladder, and let's say that you invest this $100,000 in India into a fixed deposit. Now, even though this should not be more riskier than investing in GICs in Canada, however, there is also an exchange rate risk, because we don't know how the exchange rates will play in 30 years from future. What if Indian currency has depreciated even further? It could appreciate as well, but we don't know that, and therefore I feel that there is a risk involved and we need to account for that, and that's why I've put it at number 3. The year-on-year return, let's say, is about 7%. Now, it could be lower, it could be higher, but let's say across 30 years, you are able to get a 7% return on your fixed deposits, and then you have actually almost 8x your money to about $761,000. And inflation adjusted is also pretty decent. Again, the inflation numbers that I've taken is 3% year on year. Now, let's say you are investing this money in S&P 500, which is the top 500 companies in the US. The average return is about 9 to 10% across the last 20-25 years. And now you have 13x your money, which is a lot better than putting into FDs or doing bonds and GICs. However, this comes with risk, because now you're putting into stocks, you're putting into S&P 500, and you have no control over where the market goes. Yes, it has given a year-on-year return of about 9% for the last 25 years, but that does not guarantee that the returns will be the same in the next 30 years. And therefore, even if the returns are higher, it makes it a riskier asset class. And finally, we get to real estate, where you have about 10% plus return, and honestly, the returns can be anywhere between 10 to 40% depending on the class of real estate that you buy and how much work you are putting into the real estate, and that will be worth $2 million, and I'll explain that with numbers in a minute. But let's talk about the last one, which is business, where you invest $100,000 in your business and the return is infinite. I started the YouTube channel Pure Talkies with $100. We just bought a mic and used our phones to record, and that $100 investment has now turned into a 7-figure business. So the return in your business of the same money that you put in any other asset class can be infinite. And therefore, starting a business can be very, very rewarding, but it's not for everyone, and it can lead to a lot of financial loss. Now, this is something that I talked about in my free newsletter. So if you have not subscribed to the newsletter, again, do subscribe to that. And again, I talked about my failed businesses in the newsletter that was released last week. So if you have not subscribed to the newsletter, please do subscribe to it, because there are some really good nuggets that I drop every Sunday, 8 a.m. EST. The link of that newsletter is in the description. Do subscribe to it. Now, this particular Excel is not at all for the light-hearted, but I'll try to explain the returns that you can get in real estate. So just follow me, follow the cursor here. You don't have to read into all these numbers beforehand. I'll explain every single thing. What I've done here is, let's say you purchase an investment property for about $500,000. You do a down payment of $100,000. You have a closing cost of, let's say, 3% of the purchase value. So let's say about $15,000 of closing cost, and then you are getting an interest rate of, let's say, 5%. Now, right now for investment properties, the interest rate is higher than 5%, but I'm taking over 30 years, I'm taking an average of 5%, which I feel is 1% higher than the average of 25 years at 4%. But let's take 5% for the next 30 years. The amortization is 30 years. So I've taken 30-year amortization. So the length of the loan will be 30 years. And what I've assumed is that the long-term appreciation of this real estate is about 4%. We'll do different scenarios, 3%, 2%, we can, do up and down. But in Canada, the real estate in the last 25 years has grown by over 5% year on year. So I've taken a 4%. I think it's a much lower number. And if you're investing in Canada, it's very likely that the number will be a lot higher because of the supply and demand gap, which obviously is arguable, but let's take 4%, for this particular calculation. I've also taken a rental increase of 3%. Now in markets like Calgary, the rental increases have been, crazy 8-9% because there's no rent control there. But I've taken a very, very, conservative estimate of 3% here, and I've taken an inflation rate of 3%. So all the expenses that you incur, property management, everything, all the capital expenses, I've just taken a 3%, which is an inflation rate every single year. So what we do here is, this is year one. So let's take, these 12 months of year one. This is month one. So M1, M2, M3 will be month. This particular Excel will actually be available to download, so you can do your own calculations as well. The mortgage payment, for this particular house at $400,000 of loan will be about 2,135. Then I've taken property tax of about $300. I've assumed that this is, that doesn't have a condo fee, so it's $0. Now, if you're wondering, where would you find a property like this? Calgary is one place where you can. Windsor is another place. If you want to stay in Ontario, then you can go up north in Ontario, where North Bay, Sudbury, you can actually find properties much cheaper than $500,000. So all those places, I chose Calgary, and now I have gone to US to find properties like these. But yeah, it's available. So it doesn't necessarily have to be $500,000 of condo in GTA. It can be properties which give cash flow and which are decent, and if there is enough upside in this. What I've done is, again, condo fee is $0. Insurance I've taken, so because you need to have a home insurance, a home and fire insurance, so I've taken at $125. Vacancy, I've taken 3% of rent. So in most places in Ontario, and in fact now in Calgary, the vacancy rate, which basically means that 3%. So if you are renting for 100 months, 3 or 4 months out of those 100 months, your unit will be vacant. So I've taken about 3% vacancy, 3% of the rent, just to be clear. Property management, I've taken 8% of rent. I've taken repairs of 0.5% per year, so 0.5% of $500,000, which comes to about $200 per month. If you buy newer properties, it will be much lower than that. Sometimes it can be higher. It just depends on how old the property is and how updated the appliances are. The total expenses, and obviously the spellings are wrong here, but the total expenses that you have, sorry about that, will be about $3,098. Let's assume the rent that you get is $3,000, and I'll give you an example where actually you get a much higher rent than this if you invest in the right places. But let's assume that you are getting a rent of $3,000. The profit and loss is just about $100 of loss, and the home value is $500,000. Now what I've done is that in year 2, let's say here in month 13, the mortgage payments remain the same. I've taken a 3% increase in property tax. I've taken a 3% increase in insurance. I've taken, an increase in property management. So I've just taken, everything by 3%. Everything has been increased by 3%. And the rents that I've taken is again a 3% increase. So $3,000 becomes about $3,100. And the property value, what I've assumed is, has increased by about 4%. So $500,000 moves to $520,000. And I do this for every single year till year number 30. And by the end of 30 years, what you would have done is you would have made a profit of $394,000 in cash flow, and the home is now worth over $1.6 million at a 4% appreciation. Now let's take 3% appreciation. Even then the home will be worth about $1.2 million. And overall, if you count the cash flow over 30 years, plus the home value, and obviously there'll be opportunity cost of investing the cash flow into the stock market, and then you can get a return from that. But I'm not counting that for now. You'll still make over $1.6 million. So the $100,000 that you invested, you'll turn it into $1.6 million, which is a lot higher than if you do it in S&P 500. Now I'll link this Excel in the description. You can change the numbers, you can play around with purchase price, you can do whatever you want with this Excel. In this Excel, there's also a rental analyzer. I actually explained this in my video on how to buy your first investment property. Do watch that video. I'll link it in the description, and you will know what to do with this particular sheet as well if you watch that video. So I added the cash flow over 30 years, and that's how I got the number of 2 million. Now the beauty of this 2 million number is that you also are making rent every single month. So in year number 31, your mortgage is actually $0, and you're still getting almost $7,000 in rent, and after the expenses you are still making about $5,000. So let's go back to the Excel. I forgot to explain that. Go back to the returns, and in the bottom of this particular sheet, let's go down. I've done a calculation of year number 31, the first month. You do not have any mortgage payment now. Your expenses have already, obviously increased, but this is the rent that you are getting. These are the expenses, and overall you are still making $5,000 a month of free cash flow from this particular property, and that will contribute towards your retirement. However, like I said, there are risks to real estate as well. There's liquidity risks. So once you have purchased the property, you can't just sell the property tomorrow, but you can sell your stocks tomorrow. So there's liquidity risk when it comes to real estate. There's risk of tenants not paying. There's risk of repairs. There's legal risk of someone suing you for the property. So there are risks in real estate. It's not risk free, but in order to get high returns, you have to take a higher risk. And this is the most basic example of investing in real estate, but there could be examples where you can actually multiply your money a lot faster. And I'll take that example in a bit. But first, let's understand the 5 ways of making money in real estate. The first one is principal pay down. If you're investing for cash flow, the tenant is actually paying for your principal as well as your interest and all the expenses, and therefore they are paying your principal as well. So every month when they are making your rent payment and you are making your mortgage payment, you're making cash flow, or even if it's a small negative cash flow, you are still making the principal payment and therefore paying off your loan. And most of it is taken care of by the tenant. And then you have cash flow after all the expenses. You're still making some money after the principal pay down. So that's cash flow. Then there's appreciation. Obviously, if you sell in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, you'll have appreciation because real estate appreciates at 3 to 4% every single year. In fact, appreciates about 5% for the last 20 years in Canada. But let's take about 3 to 4% increase. And then you can also take tax breaks on your capital expenditure. So it's called capital cost allowance. Now, this is not there for every single property, but you can actually have a lot more tax breaks when you're buying real estate, especially if you're selling it. And finally, you can actually take tax-free equity takeout, which is also called a refinance and reinvest. So let's say in 10 years, your property has appreciated to, let's say, 20, 30, 40%. You can take out some money from the property, and because you're taking on more debt, you are not taxed on it. And therefore, you can then use that $100,000 to purchase more real estate or invest in stocks and diversify your portfolio. And all this without compromising cash flow, because by the time you're refinancing, your rents have also increased, and because you're making more cash flow, even if you take out a little bit of money from your property, you are still making cash flow. So the reason why rich people borrow money to invest and make them richer is because they are trying to maximize on both these things. On one hand, they are reducing their interest rates on the loans that they take by buying real estate, where the banks actually gives them a lot better interest rate. And on the other hand, they are trying to maximize their returns so that they can make the difference in profit. And especially in real estate, when you have done it enough times and you're not over leveraging yourself, you can actually make this into an unlimited cycle, again, as long as you understand your risks and you're not taking too much of it. Now, before I leave this presentation, let me give you an example. So this is how I would invest right now. So these are 2 homes in Calgary. I actually talked about this in my cash flow video, investing in your first investment property as well. But let me just take that example again. So these are 2 properties. The first one can be purchased at $390,000. It's an upstairs unit of 4-bed, 2-bath. The basement is about 800 square feet, unfinished basement. So you need to develop that basement, and the reno cost will be about $80,000 because there's work required upstairs as well as downstairs. And the expected rent that you will get is about $3,800. So it's a decent property procured at a pretty decent price. The second property, the purchase price is about $450,000. The upstairs is a slightly smaller 3-bed, 2-bath. The basement is slightly bigger. It's finished, but it requires a little bit of work. The flooring needs to be changed and stuff like that. So the overall reno cost of the 2 units is about $40,000. And the expected rent is about $4,000. So if I were to invest in this particular property, I would choose property number 2 because the reno cost is a lot lower, and therefore my upfront capital that I use will be slightly lower and more manageable. Plus, if you compare these numbers, I think the second one just beats the first one by a little bit. Now let's analyze these numbers here. Let's say the purchase price is $450,000, down payment is $90,000, which is 20%, closing cost is $2,000 because in Calgary the closing cost is limited to only the lawyer fees. Renos are $40,000 holding cost because for a couple of months you are actually not getting any rent because the units are being renovated, and therefore the holding cost will be about $6,000, which is paying off the mortgage and expenses till the time you are able to put tenants in both the units. And the cash upfront, including the holding cost, will be about $138,000. So not $100,000 exactly, slightly higher than that, but let's assume these are the numbers. The mortgage on this at 7% interest rate, I've taken a pretty high interest rate, is 2,371. Net operating expenses, which includes your property taxes, your maintenance, your property manager, everything is about $915, and total expenses come to about $3,264. The rent, as I discussed, is about $4,000 if you rent out both the units, and you make a cash flow of $714. In year 2, because there's no rent control, let's assume that you increase the rents by about 5%, which is not crazy. $4,200, the cash flow becomes $900, and in year 3, again increasing the rents by about 5%, which is again not crazy for Calgary, the cash flow will be over $1,000. Now, because you have renovated the units and the downstairs unit is also legal and it has a bathroom, it has a kitchen, and therefore the value of this house actually increases by a lot. So $450,000 that you put in, that's the purchase price, plus the $40,000 that you put in to renovate the units, you actually spent about $490,000. And a usual house like this in Calgary would be worth $580,000 with 2 units. Now let's say you already have seen this video and understand debt, and therefore you know that if you do not have the Renos budget of $40,000, you can actually take your line of credits. Even if it's at 12%, you'll only be paying an interest of $400 a month that you can repay after you refinance the house, that I'll explain in the next video. And because the interest is $400, your cash flow is $700 from month number 1 after renovations. You are still making a cash flow despite paying down this Renos budget. But again, it's interest only payments and you have to pay off the $40,000, which is the principal as well. And we'll explain that in the next slide. Now let's assume it's 2 years down the line and your outstanding balance on this house is left to about $350,000. Plus you have a $40,000 of line of credit, which you have not paid. You are only paying interest on that, which is $400 a month, and still making cash flow. The new value of the house, let's assume, is $600,000. I've not taken a massive appreciation here. The 580 where we forced appreciation, I've just taken $20,000 on top of that. So in 2 years, it'll appreciate a lot more than that. But let's assume it's $600,000 and you go to the bank and you take a new loan of $480,000, which is 80% of 600 at 5% interest rate. Again, the 25-year average of interest rates is between 4 to 4.5% for rental properties. I've still taken 5%, which is a little bit high for 2026. Now, if you do the maths here, you have an outstanding balance of $390. You got $480,000 of new loan, and therefore you are left with $90,000 of equity takeout. And because this is debt, you're not taxed on it. So now you have new money of $90,000 in your bank account, and the numbers still make sense because the mortgage payment is now $2,562. It's not increased a lot, even though our overall mortgage amount has increased. Because the interest rate is a lot lower, your mortgage payment will still be $2,562. Your net operating expenses, because 2 years down the line with inflation and everything, let's say it has increased to about $1,200. Your total expenses are $3,762. The year 3 rents will be $4,450. We already discussed that in our previous slide. The cash flow is still $700. And year 4 and year 5, obviously the cash flow keeps increasing. Now you can use this $90,000 plus any amount of cash that you have saved to buy another investment property. So what you're essentially doing is, because you're doing the renos, you're putting some sweat equity into it, you're forcing appreciation into your home, you are able to make a much more than 10% return on your investment. And not only that, you can actually repeat the cycle of buying cheap debt, turning a much bigger profit, refinancing the entire thing and repeating it. And of course it involves risk, and it's not for everyone. So of course it involves risk, and if you're not the kind of person who wants to take risk, I would highly recommend that you put your money into S&P 500 or any other safe vehicle where it does not give you any anxiety, because real estate is not for the light-hearted. The reason why I say that is there is obviously a risk that the tenants do not pay rent. There's obviously a risk of breaking things. And the way I mitigate these two risks is that I distribute risk. What I mean by that is I either buy a duplex or an 8plex. My US one is an 8plex, and what happens is if someone doesn't pay rent, it's not like everyone is not paying rent. That's why I don't like single family homes. For example, I have a condo in Kitchener, and if the tenant doesn't pay rent, I make $0 and I have to incur all the expenses. However, in my Calgary property and my US property, if one tenant doesn't pay rent, I still cover part of my expenses from the rent coming from the other unit. And that's one way of distributing risk. The other way is partnering with people. For example, my US property is being bought by 4 partners, including me, and my Calgary property is bought by 2 partners, including me. And that way you distribute your losses and your gains, of course, but your returns are much more balanced that way. Plus, I always take emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of expenses and keep that in the investment property account. So let's say in Calgary, my expenses are about $3,000. I'll keep about $10,000 to $20,000 of access money into it. That way, if something goes wrong, it's taken care of by this emergency fund for that rental property. Then of course, there's a risk of what if the market crashes, and that can be mitigated by 2 things. One, forcing appreciation. Just in this example where you built the basement, we renovated the unit and forced $90,000 of appreciation by putting $40,000 into the unit. So that's forced appreciation, because even if the market goes down, your house is worth more purely because it's newer looking. And the fact is that you do not lose money when the market crashes unless you sell the home. Because we are investing for cash flow, we can hold on to the property till the time it recovers. And therefore, by doing all these 4 things, and of course working with a team which knows what they are doing, you can mitigate all the risks that you can have and have those 10% plus returns, so that you can maximize the return on the debt. I hope you like this video. Do share it with a friend who is on the fence to invest in real real estate, and do subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to not miss any of these insightful videos. मिलते हैं अगली वीडियो में, तब तक के लिए बाय बाय.